Father Elias had always felt an unusual sense of wonder about the world around him. His heart belonged to his congregation, and he poured himself into his work, guiding those in need with quiet wisdom. Yet, deep within, a part of him wondered if there was more to the world than what the eye could see. He often found solace in the quiet corners of the church, reading books of ancient lore and scriptures, searching for deeper meanings and lost knowledge. It was one such evening, as dusk settled over the small town of Bellwood, when Elias uncovered something that would change everything. The church library, tucked away in the rear of the old building, held rows of dusty tomes, many of which hadn't been opened in decades. The air in the library smelled faintly of parchment and candle wax, and the low, golden light from the evening sun barely filtered through the stained glass windows. Elias was sorting through a shelf of forgotten books when his fingers brushed against something different. It wasn't bound like the others. Its cover was worn and cracked, the pages yellowed with age. As he pulled it out, he felt an odd tingle run through his fingertips. The book was surprisingly light, almost weightless. Its title was in an ancient script, barely legible, but something about it called to him. Curiosity got the best of him. He opened the book, and the first page contained a series of strange symbols, each one more intricate than the last. At the center of the page was a drawing of a human mind, outlined with delicate swirling lines. Below it was a description in Latin, a language Elias had studied in his youth. With some effort, he translated the words. To hear the voice of God, one must first hear the minds of men. The mind, like the heart, has secrets. Unlock them, and the divine will speak. Elias paused, the words stirring something deep within him. The idea of understanding the minds of others was not new to him. He had always been in tune with the needs of his congregation. But this was something entirely different. The promise of connecting with the divine in a more direct, profound way, by reading minds. It seemed impossible, yet strangely alluring. The priest flipped through more pages, each one detailing steps, rituals, and chants that would open the mind to this powerful ability. The further he read, the more he felt a pull, as though the book was beckoning him to try, to test the limits of human understanding. That night, under the dim light of a solitary candle, Father Elias made his decision. He would try the ritual, just once. He would test the boundaries of this power, convinced that it was meant for good. He had no idea that this innocent curiosity would soon unlock a door that, once opened, could never be closed again. With his hands trembling, Elias began to prepare the ritual, unaware of the storm of consequences he was about to unleash. The ritual was simple in its execution, yet filled with ancient and intricate details. Father Elias had carefully followed the instructions in the book. Light a single candle, focus on his breathing, and recite the chant. The words flowed from his lips, ancient and foreign, their rhythm strangely soothing as they echoed in the silence of the church. The air around him seemed to thrum with an invisible energy, as if the very walls of the sanctuary were listening. As he finished the final line of the chant, the candle flickered, casting strange shadows across the room. For a brief moment, everything was still. Then, a sudden rush, like a distant roar, filled Elias's ears. His pulse quickened, and his mind seemed to expand, stretching beyond the confines of his skull. The world around him seemed to blur, as though his senses were no longer bound by the ordinary limits of sight and sound. And then, it happened. The thoughts came to him, not as whispers, but as clear, distinct voices, all speaking at once. At first, the sensation was disorienting. He could hear the inner monologues of everyone in the church, even those who had long since left the building. The baker down the street was thinking about the new bread recipe he was planning to try tomorrow. The widow across town was recalling memories of her late husband, feeling a sharp pang of loneliness. The children playing in the streets outside were lost in their innocent daydreams, unaware of the priest's intrusion. Father Elias blinked, overwhelmed. It wasn't just his own mind he could hear. It was everyone. Every thought, Every worry, every hope, all flooding into him like a torrent of voices. At first, it was fascinating. He could hear people's deepest feelings, the secrets they kept hidden, their unspoken fears and desires. It was a window into their souls, something he had never experienced before. As the minutes passed, the voices became louder, sharper. The thoughts were no longer polite or simple. They were raw, chaotic. A mother's frustration with her children mingled with her love for them. A man's regret over a long-lost opportunity swirled with the hope of redemption. It was overwhelming, a constant stream of noise, like trying to listen to 1,000 radios all tuned to different stations at once. Father Elias's heart raced. He could no longer tell where his own thoughts ended and others began. Each voice seemed to gnaw at him, pulling him deeper into their private worlds. The barrage of emotions, guilt, shame, lust, sorrow, was unbearable. His head began to throb, his hands shaking as the weight of it all pressed in on him. But he couldn't stop. He couldn't escape. For every thought he tried to focus on, a new one flooded in, drowning him further. The once peaceful church now felt like a prison of minds. And yet, through it all, a part of him, desperate for understanding, couldn't help but listen, even as the noise tore at his sanity. Father Elias had unlocked the minds of his congregation, but he hadn't anticipated how much he would come to regret hearing everything they thought. The next morning, Father Elias awoke with a headache that throbbed behind his eyes, a sharp, pulsing reminder of the events from the night before. His first instinct was to reach for the comfort of his familiar surroundings, his prayer book, the worn pews of the church, the soft light streaming through stained glass windows. But something felt different. The air felt thick, charged with an invisible pressure. His thoughts, once his own, now seemed crowded, as if the very walls of his mind had been breached. The voices had not stopped. They were still there, buzzing incessantly in the back of his mind, like an army of whispers just beneath the surface. He could hear the grocer's thoughts as she sorted her produce, the town blacksmith's worries about his tools, the anxious reverberations of children practicing their lessons in the schoolhouse. It was all there, flowing into him faster than he could process. Elias clutched his head, trying to focus. The more he fought it, the worse it became. His thoughts began to splinter. Instead of a single, coherent voice, there were hundreds, thousands swirling around him, each demanding his attention. The thoughts weren't simply noise. They were alive, vivid, and personal. The deeper he went, the more intimate they became. As he walked into the church to prepare for morning mass, the thoughts of his parishioners were nearly deafening. Sister Anne was worrying about a decision she'd made years ago, wondering if she had truly forgiven herself. Mr. Harland, a farmer from the outskirts of town, was reflecting on the troubles with his crops. He was angry at the sky, blaming the weather for his failures. The townspeople's minds swirled around him, overwhelming and endless. He staggered to the altar, trying to ignore the assault on his senses. It wasn't just their voices, it was their emotions too. The joy of a mother sending her child off to school, the ache of a broken heart, the flicker of resentment between two old friends. The flood of raw feelings was suffocating. How could he have thought this was a gift? The worst of it was the thoughts he couldn't shake, the hidden desires, the secret fears. Some of them were innocuous. A man wondering if he would ever find love again, a woman wondering what life might have been like if she'd taken a different path. But others were darker, more troubling, long-buried desires, whispered confessions of betrayal, and moments of selfishness that no one could escape. Elias could feel his grip on reality slipping. His mind was no longer his own. He couldn't remember what it felt like to think a single uninterrupted thought. Every moment was filled with the mental clutter of others, sometimes distant, sometimes so close it felt like he was inside their very souls. Desperately, he tried to block it out. He closed his eyes, clutching the edges of the altar as if it were his only anchor in a world gone mad. But the thoughts kept coming. They would never stop. This power was not a gift. It was a curse. And now, Elias knew with a sickening certainty that there was no turning back. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of relentless thoughts. Father Elias could no longer distinguish between his own mind and the never-ending flood of voices that filled his head. Each morning, he woke to the same cacophony, the thoughts of the entire town pressing in on him, like a tidal wave crashing against the fragile shore of his sanity. It was no longer just a hum in the background. It was a constant, gnawing presence, suffocating him in its intensity. His once serene life was slipping away, and so was his connection to the world he had known. The people of Bellwood began to notice the change. At first, it was subtle, small inconsistencies in his behavior. His sermons, once full of warmth and conviction, now lacked their usual clarity. He stumbled over words, pausing for long moments as if searching for the right thing to say. But the words were elusive, lost in the labyrinth of other people's thoughts. During Mass, Elias found himself distracted, his gaze wandering as fragments of his parishioners' minds danced in front of him. Mrs. Goodwin, the elderly widow in the front row, was thinking about the day her husband died. The image of him lying cold in their shared bed haunted her still. He could hear her sorrow, feel it, as if it were his own. The constant flood of memories, regrets, and quiet wishes consumed him, leaving him unable to focus on the ritual of the service. His once powerful presence in the church, the unwavering pillar of guidance, had begun to unravel. He found himself snapping at parishioners, his patience threadbare. One morning, after a young child approached him to ask for blessings, Elias lashed out unexpectedly, his voice sharp with frustration. "Do you think I don't know what you're really thinking?" He had yelled, his eyes wild with the strain of trying to silence the relentless barrage of thoughts. The child, confused and frightened, ran from the church, and the congregation murmured uneasily. It was only then that Elias realized how far he had fallen from the man he used to be. He could see it in their eyes, the same looks that now followed him everywhere he went. There was fear in the air, the kind that you felt when something was terribly wrong, yet you couldn't pinpoint why. People whispered behind his back, unsure of what had happened to the priest they had once trusted. At night, Elias would sit alone in his chambers, his head buried in his hands, trying desperately to shut out the voices. But they never stopped. Sometimes, the thoughts became so loud that he could barely breathe, drowning in the sea of others' emotions. His own identity seemed to blur, swallowed up by the endless waves. It was as if he had become a part of everyone, and yet no longer himself. He knew he was losing control. He had to find a way to stop it, before he completely vanished into the storm of other people's minds. Father Elias had been trying to ignore the growing sense of dread that haunted him. The thought of seeking help felt like a failure, a betrayal of the sacred trust he had always embodied. But as the days stretched on, each more unbearable than the last, Elias realized that the road he had chosen was leading him toward an irreversible collapse. The voices were no longer just an inconvenience. They were a force that threatened to consume him entirely. He could no longer go on alone. There had to be someone, anyone, who could understand what he was experiencing. And so, with great reluctance, he turned to a name he had once dismissed, Dr. Adrian Blackwell. Dr. Blackwell had been a renowned scientist, once respected for his work in psychology and metaphysical studies. But after a series of controversial experiments in the late 90s, Adrian had abandoned the scientific community and retreated into seclusion. Now a reclusive hermit living on the edge of Bellwood, he was known for his bizarre theories about the human mind and psychic abilities. Most people considered him mad, but Elias knew that Blackwell was one of the few who might understand what he was going through. Elias sought him out one cold, rainy evening. The journey took him through the dense woods at the outskirts of town, where the towering trees seemed to press in on him, as if nature itself were holding him captive. The house at the end of the trail was small, old, and surrounded by an aura of mystery. Smoke curled from the chimney, and the dim light of lanterns flickered through the windows. He knocked on the door, heart pounding in his chest. When it opened, Dr. Blackwell stood before him, his face as weathered as the house behind him. His eyes, though tired, gleamed with a sharpness that suggested he hadn't missed a single thing about Elias's arrival. "You've come," Blackwell said, his voice low and almost amused. "I knew you would eventually." Elias, feeling the weight of his situation more than ever, simply nodded. "I don't know what's happening to me. The voices, the thoughts, they never stop. It's driving me mad." Dr. Blackwell motioned for him to come inside. The interior of the house was dimly lit, filled with strange artifacts and shelves of books that looked as though they hadn't been touched in years. It was as though the very air was heavy with secrets. Blackwell led Elias to a chair near the fire, where he sat down, eyes narrowed in thought. "I can help you," Blackwell said, "but you need to understand something first. This power you've tapped into, it's not something you can control with mere willpower. It's ancient, far older than we can comprehend, and there are consequences." Elias listened intently, his heart racing. "What do I need to do?" Blackwell studied him for a long moment before answering. "There's a way to reverse the ritual, but it's not without risk. If we attempt it, we could sever your mind permanently, or worse, leave you trapped in a state of madness forever. You'll have to decide if it's worth the gamble." The choice weighed heavily on Elias's chest, but the alternative, living in this maddening storm of thoughts, was unthinkable. He had no other option. "I'll do it," Elias said, his voice barely a whisper. "I can't keep living like this." Dr. Blackwell nodded solemnly. "Then it begins." As Elias prepared for what might be his only chance at redemption, he had no idea what would come next. Would he survive the process? Or would he lose himself entirely? The air in Dr. Blackwell's cottage seemed to thicken as Elias sat before the old man, anxiety building in his chest. Blackwell, his face lit only by the flickering fire, looked far older than Elias remembered from his brief studies years ago. His hands trembled slightly as he gathered the strange implements he would need for the procedure, a collection of herbs, crystals, and aged scrolls that seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. The ritual that Blackwell proposed was both simple and terrifying, designed to sever the connection between Elias and the thoughts of others. But before they began, Blackwell paused, looking at Elias with a strange intensity. "Before we attempt this," Blackwell said, "you need to understand what you're dealing with. You think this is an isolated incident, something that happened to you by chance. But this power, it's not new to your family. It's been passed down for generations, hidden in the bloodline." Elias stared at him, confused. "What do you mean? My family has always been ordinary. We have no history of." "Your family is anything but ordinary," Blackwell interrupted. "You are the latest in a long line of individuals cursed, or blessed, depending on your perspective, with the ability to hear the minds of others." Elias felt a cold wave wash over him. His mind reeled, struggling to process what Blackwell was saying. "You're saying this has happened before? To my ancestors?" Blackwell nodded slowly, his expression darkening. "Yes, your lineage traces back to an ancient order, one that discovered the power to read minds, long before it was documented by modern science. But it's a power that comes with a terrible price." He rose from his chair and began pulling a large leather-bound tome from one of the shelves. The book was old, its cover cracked and yellowed with age. He opened it to a page filled with diagrams and notes in a language Elias did not understand. "This is the history of your family," Blackwell continued, pointing to an illustration of an ancient ritual, remarkably similar to the one Elias had performed. "It's a ritual passed down through the generations, though your ancestors abandoned it after the tragedy of one of their own." Elias leaned in, his curiosity piqued despite the swirling thoughts that never stopped in his mind. Blackwell's voice grew quieter, more somber. "One of your great-great-grandfathers, Caius the Seer, attempted to use the ritual on a grander scale. He believed he could connect with all of humanity, read the minds of the world. But it shattered him. His mind couldn't handle a flood of thoughts, and he went mad, taking the entire town with him. The town of Verendale was lost to the madness, and the family was forced to flee. The weight of Blackwell's words hit Elias like a stone. He felt the burden of his bloodline pressing down on him, the realization that he had unwittingly inherited this cursed gift. "You've tapped into something dangerous, Elias," Blackwell said, his voice grave. "The ritual works, but only for those who are prepared to face what it reveals. The reason your mind has been ravaged is because you were never meant to hear so much. The voices will only grow stronger if you don't sever the connection completely." Elias felt a chill in his bones. "And if I don't sever it, what happens?" Blackwell didn't answer directly. Instead, he fixed Elias with a piercing gaze. "You'll become like Caius, or worse. The voices will consume you, and you'll lose yourself entirely." Elias's heart raced. His only choice was to proceed. There was no turning back now. "Let's begin," Elias said, his voice trembling but firm. The room fell silent, the weight of Blackwell's warning hanging heavily in the air. Elias's heart pounded in his chest, and his breath quickened as Blackwell prepared the ritual. The fire crackled softly, casting strange, flickering shadows across the room, but the atmosphere was anything but peaceful. Every part of Elias' being screamed to run, to abandon the ritual, but the thoughts that had once felt like a curse now seemed like an ever-present weight, pushing him forward. He had no other choice. Blackwell turned to face him, a solemn expression on his face. "You must remain still and calm. If you fight this process, it could cause more harm than good. Understand?" Elias nodded, though he wasn't sure how he would maintain any semblance of calm with the torrent of voices in his mind. Every passing second felt like a battle to retain his identity. It was as though 1,000 people were shouting at him all at once, each thought, each emotion, each desire crashing into him. It had been like this for days, no, weeks, and now, with the weight of his ancestors' curse pressing down on him, he couldn't help but wonder how much longer he could endure. Blackwell reached for the crystal at the center of the ritual circle, a smooth, opaque stone that pulsed with an eerie light. He held it between his hands, and as he began to chant, the air seemed to thicken around them. Elias could feel a strange warmth radiating from the crystal, and suddenly he became aware of something else, a low hum that began to vibrate through the very walls of the cottage. The energy in the room shifted, growing more intense. "Focus," Blackwell's voice cut through the fog of Elias's thoughts. "You need to push everything out, block the voices from entering." Elias squeezed his eyes shut, gritting his teeth. The thoughts of the people in Bellwood came crashing into him all at once. He could hear the laughter of children, the desperate prayers of the dying, the quiet longing of unspoken love. It was like drowning in a sea of emotions, unable to surface. His head began to throb, pain radiating through his skull. And then something shifted. For the first time since he had performed the ritual, Elias felt a tug deep within his mind, a pull, like a thread being yanked. He gasped, his body trembling as Blackwell's chant grew louder, more forceful. The crystal in his hands began to glow brighter, and Elias felt the voices begin to separate from him, pulling away like a tide receding from the shore. But it wasn't painless. The severing was raw, jagged as though something inside him was being torn apart. Elias's breath came in ragged gasps, his body jerking involuntarily with each sharp pulse of energy. The sensation was so intense, so alien, that for a moment he feared he might lose himself entirely. "Stay with me, Elias," Blackwell shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos in Elias's mind. "Don't lose yourself now." It was a battle against his own mind, against the very essence of what he had become. Each moment felt like an eternity, and Elias was starting to feel like he couldn't hold on much longer. But then, just as the pain seemed unbearable, the tide of voices began to recede. Slowly at first, but then faster, like a great flood being siphoned away, until there was nothing left. The room fell silent. The voices were gone. Elias opened his eyes slowly, blinking in disbelief. His mind felt empty. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was quiet. He felt the stillness in his thoughts, the weightlessness of silence. But as he looked up at Blackwell, the old man's expression was grim. "It's not over," Blackwell muttered. "Not yet." Elias's heart sank. "What do you mean?" Blackwell stared at him, his eyes darkening. "You've severed the connection. But now, you must face the truth of what you've done. The cost is greater than you can imagine." Elias's stomach twisted. He had no idea what lay ahead, but he knew now, more than ever, that the consequences of his actions were far from over. The quiet that followed the severing was almost unnerving, like the calm before a storm. Elias sat motionless, feeling the emptiness in his mind, a strange and unsettling stillness that felt foreign after so long immersed in a torrent of thoughts. For the first time in weeks, he could hear nothing but his own breathing, the soft crackling of the fire in the hearth. The relief was palpable, and yet a deep unease gnawed at him. Blackwell stood silently, watching him, the lines of worry deepening on his face. There was no comfort in his expression, only a grim understanding of what had just transpired. "I did it," Elias whispered, his voice hoarse, as if he had forgotten how to speak in the silence. "No," Blackwell said softly, his gaze unwavering. "You've only done half the work. The ritual severed your connection to the minds of others, but it also severed your connection to something far more dangerous, the part of you that was tied to your family's legacy. You've removed yourself from the curse, Elias, but you've also removed a part of who you are. And now you must decide what you will become." Elias stared at Blackwell, his mind still processing the magnitude of what had just happened. He had stopped the flood of thoughts, yes, but at what cost? He had severed the link that connected him to the world of minds, but in doing so, had he cut himself off from something essential? Was he now simply a shell of a man, a stranger to his own existence? "I don't understand," Elias murmured, his voice shaky. "You said the cost would be great. What does that mean for me?" Blackwell took a deep breath, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of what he had to say was too heavy to bear. "What you don't understand, Elias, is that your bloodline wasn't just cursed, it was chosen. The ability to read minds was not some random gift. It was the legacy of a powerful ancient order. And now that you've severed your connection, the order itself has no heir. The knowledge, the power, the responsibility, it's all been lost." Elias felt a shiver run down his spine. "So, I've destroyed everything." "No," Blackwell said quickly. "Not everything. But your choices have left the path forward unclear. The order may fade from history now, unless someone takes its place, someone who can embrace the power and the burden, who can rebuild what has been lost." Elias's heart raced as he processed this. He had thought the severing would be the end of his torment, that it would allow him to return to a normal life. But now, the weight of responsibility loomed larger than ever. "So I'm free?" Elias asked, his voice trembling with uncertainty. "For now," Blackwell replied. "But remember this, power doesn't die, it only shifts. And there's always a price to be paid. You've only begun to see the consequences of what you've done." Elias stood, his legs unsteady beneath him. He didn't know what would come next. Would he live a quiet life, free from the burden of hearing others' thoughts? Or would something even darker rise in its place? He didn't know the answers, but one thing was certain, his life would never be the same again. And as the fire flickered low in the hearth, Elias realized that the true cost of his decision was yet to unfold. The silence, though a blessing, had its own dangers. The legacy of his ancestors wasn't something he could escape so easily. He could feel its presence in the very air around him, like a shadow watching, waiting.